Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
After 2 years of bloodshed, a fragile and uncertain ceasefire has settled over Gaza. The truce rests on tenuous ground after recent flare-ups of violence punctured the brief calm, with each side accusing the other of violations. Top Trump administration officials have been in Israel this week to shore up the agreement and try to advance the president's 20-point peace proposal, showing the difficult road ahead to keeping the ceasefire alive, let alone make further progress. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Akaash Maharaj, Senior Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, to discuss the obstacles that loom over Middle East peace and the role Canada can play in delivering it. Akaash, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. Thank you so much for joining.
It's lovely to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation.
The White House was working this week to hold together the Gaza peace deal. A recent flare-up of violence, of course, highlighted the ceasefire's fragility. I suppose, what is your assessment of where things stand right now?
Well, this plan has been fragile from the very start. That fragility, as you say, continues. And every step of the way, the plan will be dancing on the ragged edge of disaster. Having said that, even a deeply flawed and perilous peace plan is better than no plan at all. J.D. Vance has been dispatched as Donald Trump's personal envoy, and he has said that he believes the peace process is going better than he had expected. That makes me wonder what his expectations were. But the peace, such as it is holding. That's not to say that people aren't being shot, bombed, killed, that people aren't dying of hunger, and it's not to say that all of the hostages or all of the remains of the hostages have been returned. None of those things have been pushed over the finish line, but we are in a better situation than we were 2 weeks ago.
You say that we're in a better position than we were 2 weeks ago. I wonder, the fact that even though we have seen small bursts of violence, they've been short-lived. Even Israel's walking back of its threat to shut off the flow of aid into Gaza. Does this all kind of suggest to you that what's so far keeping this truce on track is solely the power being brought by the Trump administration?
I would say so, yes. The Trump administration has been the Netanyahu government's most stalwart ally. It's Netanyahu's primary source of money, of weapons, and now almost its only source of support at diplomatic institutions around the world. That does mean that the Trump administration has tremendous leverage over Israel. Netanyahu, for all of his hardline policies, is not by any stretch of the imagination the most nationalistic or hardest line member of his cabinet. He, in his coalition, includes people who are far more strident than he is. With that in mind, I suspect that there's much arguing around the Israeli cabinet table about whether they should comply with the U.S. demands. But realistically, though Israel could prosecute this war without the support of the United States, the outcome and the impact on the government and the people of Israel becomes far more uncertain if the United States withdraws its support. Trump and his administration are keeping Netanyahu and his administration at the table, but it is a shaky peace.
Yeah, just how much longer do you think Washington is going to be able to exert their kind of restraining influence over Israel?
That is a very difficult question to answer. Often the rhetoric that comes out of the American administration bears little connections to its deeds on the ground, and that's true both in the United States and in the international forum. Peace in the Middle East has been elusive for generations, and so anyone who wants to press forward the cause of peace must have a deep commitment to the cause of peace, must have staying power, and must have the ability to continue working even when the cameras have moved on to other questions in the media. None of those qualities are characteristic of the Trump administration. It is hyperactive. It jumps around from question to question and issue to issue. Donald Trump himself often changes his mind from the start of a sentence towards the end of a sentence. I would not bet on how long Donald Trump is going to remain seized up and interested in the conflict in the Middle East. But as long as he does so, he will have an impact on the government of Israel and on the Netanyahu administration. It's likely, though by no means certain, that some of the voices within the Trump administration have been urging him to play this role, this stronger role in the peace process in the Middle East, because of changes in popular opinion in the US. The Americans are heading towards their midterm elections. There's a very real possibility that Trump's party, the Republicans, could lose control of the legislature, and there are a whole variety of reasons for why that might happen. But one of those reasons is that American opinion has shifted over time. There's now, if the polls are to be believed, and that is a significant caveat, a plurality of Americans who support the creation of a state of Palestine. That is quite new in the United States, and it, I think, has demonstrated to Trump and to his political advisors that they have to be shown or have to be seen to be playing some kind of a role for the cause of peace in the Middle East if they are to have any chance of emerging from the midterm elections with their majority intact.
So what would that continued, I suppose, American intervention need to look like to keep this ceasefire alive, let alone to make further progress?
Well, part of it is restraining some of the ambitions of the ultranationalists within the Netanyahu cabinet. So, for example, there was recently a vote to annex the West Bank that would be calamitous for the cause of peace or stability in the region. There have been about 150 tons of bombs dropped on Gaza, even after the ceasefire. And that is still a small percentage of what the Netanyahu administration might choose to do were to prosecute this role without restraint. To put it into context, on the eve of the peace plan being announced and signed by both the Israelis and the Palestinians, Netanyahu was moving troops in on Gaza City. He had said to the Palestinian people that they were to evacuate Gaza City and anyone who remained there would be regarded as a terrorist and therefore a legitimate target for liquidation by the Israeli forces. There are still about 300 to 400,000 people in Gaza City, and they are there not because they want to be there. They're there because they have nowhere else to go. No adjoining country will take them, and there are no safe havens within Gaza as a territory, and even if there were, there's no way to get there from Gaza City. It's impossible to know whether Netanyahu was going to follow through on that threat. It might just have been saber-rattling. It might just have been a menace. But if he was serious about that, if he was serious about liquidating 300 to 400,000 people in Gaza City, that would have been one of the gravest mass slaughters in this century. That has been held at bay by this peace plan. And in that context, this peace plan, as flawed as it is, and as unlikely as it is to bring about a lasting peace, is still a minor miracle.
There are a few things I want to ask you about based on your answer. The first being the fact that, bombs are still being dropped on Gaza. And though the violence so far has been contained, the far-right members of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition are already demanding an immediate return to the all-out assault against Hamas. Do you see this perhaps devolving eventually into a full resumption of the war, or do you see this becoming a war of attrition where there are sort of everyday accusations of violations and clashes?
I suspect that what's going to happen is that either Netanyahu will walk away from the peace deal or his government will fall. And one of the great perils to this peace plan is precisely the hard political reality that neither of the two antagonists at the table, neither the Netanyahu administration in Israel nor the Hamas administration in Gaza, really has a political interest in peace. the Netanyahu government is wildly unpopular, even before in Israel, even before the Hamas attack on Israel. Israel was seeing the largest protest in its history against Prime Minister Netanyahu. Throughout the past 2 years, while he has been prosecuting this war, he has also himself been prosecuted in Israeli courts on very serious charges of corruption. He has been maintained in office because, and only because, the people of Israel have recognized that it would be reckless to change governments in the middle of a war. But if the war ends, if there is in fact a durable peace, then almost certainly his government will fall. The overwhelming majority of Israelis say that they want Netanyahu either to resign immediately or to call in elections so that they have an opportunity to vote him out of office. Knowing that peace means the end of power for him gives him every incentive to work against peace. Similarly, with Hamas, they are 19 years into a 4-year term of office, and they have sustained themselves in office because they, through a combination of terrorism, brutality, and cancelled elections, they have consistently cancelled elections because they have known that given the opportunity, the Palestinian people would vote them out of office. They too have sustained themselves through this war and through the absence of peace. They know that if there is a peace in Gaza, this peace holds, part of the price of that peace is that not only are they required to give up their control of Gaza, they are not allowed even to run in the next election. They're not allowed to play any role in the governance of Gaza. So when you have two groups of people on opposite sides of the table, ostensibly negotiating for peace, but both those groups of people who are in love with the power they hold over their people know that peace means the end of power for them, then it's difficult to see how peace arrives. That is the true core of the fragility of this situation. They are being held there in part because right now both those sides fear the political consequences of being seen to walk away from the table. But the political reality is that both Hamas and Netanyahu are looking for excuses to walk away from the table.
So is there anything that outside powers can do in terms of pressure or incentive to keep Israel and Hamas at the table, but also to inspire perhaps a true desire for peace in the region?
I think there is. And this peace plan, though it is only a glimmer of hope, it's the only glimmer we have. Many parts of it are remarkable. So, for example, the peace plan calls for the demilitarization, the disarming of Hamas. And no one really knows how that will happen. But countries like Canada can play a role in that. The language in Trump's peace plan that Hamas's weapons must be put beyond practical use, those are words that are lifted almost word for word from the Good Friday Agreement, the peace agreement that ended the conflict in Northern Ireland. And the person who was in charge of disarming the IRA and the loyalist paramilitary organizations was General John de Chastelain, a Canadian general. It demonstrates that Canadians are often trusted to play these kinds of roles. That is to say, the very difficult, very technical, very grueling, and completely unglamorous work of the practical application, the practical disarming of antagonists. I would hope that the government of Canada might be prepared to step forward and say that a new generation of Canadian diplomats and Canadian military leaders stand ready to play the role that was once played by men like General de Chastelain. The other part is, again, really remarkably, the peace plan calls for the insertion of an international stabilization force in Gaza. This is not exactly a peacekeeping force. It's meant to be groups of security forces from outside states. The United States, certainly, probably the United Kingdom, and other countries who are willing to put up their hand, whose first job would be to train the Palestinian police force so that they can restore order to Gaza. But this would be a historic achievement, in part because both the Palestinians and the Israelis have historically resisted the presence of foreign actors on the ground in the Palestinian territories. They have often felt that they don't want foreign states or foreign powers casting the deciding vote or making the decisions about the future of the region. And the Netanyahu government in particular has been very hostile to what it has called the internationalization of the conflict. But the presence of third-party actors from other states on the ground in Gaza, standing between the Israelis and the Palestinians, might be the one path to peace in the region.
Do you actually think countries like Canada and its allies will be willing to support an international stabilization force beyond lip service? Because so far they've kind of states have signaled that they're not kind of willing to send ground troops to be a part of this force that is yet to be formed, and have kind of signaled that, they're worried about direct confrontation with Hamas. What does it take to actually get them to commit to something like this?
Well, the truth is that all politics is local, and whether a country like Canada is willing to pledge personnel to an international stabilization force or to pledge diplomats to work on disarming of Hamas has very little to do with the rights and the wrongs of the conflict or about the Israelis or Palestinians. It has everything to do with domestic political opinion. The real question is, will the people of Canada support the deploying of Canadian personnel into the Middle East? And will they continue supporting Canadian personnel in the Middle East if those personnel come home in body bags because they've been shot by terrorists or blown up by aerial bombardment? I don't know the answer to that. I know that there has been an outpouring of grief in Canada about the amount of carnage we have seen in the Middle East. And I know that there are many Canadians, especially Jewish and Muslim Canadians, who have family on opposite sides of the barricades and of the lines of demarcation. And those communities in Canada are desperately worried about what will happen to their families tomorrow. I suspect that a majority of Canadians would support Canada playing a peacekeeping role in the Middle East, but only if there's a viable peace. I think that this is one of those instances where politicians have to be prepared to lead public opinion rather than being led by it. The last time Canada was a truly formidable force in international peacekeeping was, or the first time we were a formidable force was under Prime Minister Lester Pearson, who created the UN peacekeeping forces. I think it's fair to say that when he did that, both as Prime Minister and previously as our ambassador to the United Nations, there was very little support for it in Canada. Most Canadians at that point had no idea what he was talking about and were very skeptical about whether these kinds of measures could work. But it ended up being one of the great contributions our country has made to the human condition. I think we can do that again. But I think the difference between Lester Pearson and the current generation, the current political class that governs our country, either on the government benches or on the opposition benches, is that Pearson and his generation of leaders understood that they had a calling to inspire the country to do things that they did not already want to do, whereas many politicians today are guided by what the polls tell them the people already want to do.
I want to ask you about this too, because the American Vice President said this week that international security force would also take the lead on disarming Hamas. Is that a credible plan?
I would say that is a very broad statement. It's not a plan at all. It's an expression of an intention. But I suspect that Vance, in particular, is imagining that the International Stabilization Force will be made up almost entirely or largely by American troops, and that it will be able to enforce its will in the region. I think that a stabilization force that's dominated by any one country is not a good idea, and a stabilization force that is viewed as just an extension of the American military is likely to to very quickly become a target, especially a target from Hamas and Hamas's sympathizers. It's in the best interest of the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Americans themselves for that stabilization force to be a truly multinational force. If it is, then it is plausible that it can play a role in disarming Hamas. But if it's just an extension of the Trump administration, then I suspect that it will be on the receiving end of fire, not taking possession of firearms.
As we consider who will govern Gaza in the future and how, I want to return to your comments on the West Bank, because of course, as you mentioned earlier, that bill applying Israeli law to the West Bank, which is seen as amounting to annexation of that territory, it gained preliminary approval by Israeli lawmakers this week. When J.D. Vance and other Trump officials say this will not be the policy of Washington, how serious do you think they are?
Trump changes his mind every day. And even his closest allies say, you should take him seriously, but don't take him literally. I don't know what you're supposed to do with a political leader when his words can change the course of global affairs, and yet he himself is saying, you can't take me literally. You can't place too much stock in what I'm saying. If the Trump administration stands by this, if they stand by an insistence that Israel must not annex the West Bank, and if they're willing to back that up by saying to Netanyahu, if you proceed with this annexation, then we will withhold money and weapons, then it will make a difference. The Netanyahu government will not proceed. But there's also the question, I would say, of Israeli popular opinion. Although there are certainly ultranationalists in the Netanyahu cabinet and ultranationalists in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, who do want to see the West Bank annexed, there's no sense that a majority of Israelis want this. And in the last call-up, when Netanyahu was beginning to move on Gaza City, he called up about 250,000 people, 250,000 reservists. About one-third of those reservists who were being activated for an assault on Gaza City refused to turn up. They simply did not turn up for duty. And that is extraordinary. For Israel, it is extraordinary for people to refuse the call, for reservists to refuse the call to be mobilized. And we have not seen that level of refusal throughout the previous 2 years. I think that demonstrates that increasingly the people of Israel have lost confidence in Netanyahu and how he is conducting this war. And I think that there is a significant level of belief within the Israeli population that this war is being extended by Netanyahu to serve his own ambitions. If there were an attempt by Netanyahu and his administration to go beyond words and into deeds, to actually try to annex the West Bank, I suspect the people who would stop him are probably not members of the American administration. It's more likely to be the population of Israel. For about 2 years, most Israelis have just wanted the hostages back. And for 2 years, I think there has been a general consensus within Israel that in prosecuting this war, the hostages have not been high on Netanyahu's priorities. If he were to turn his eyes towards the West Bank, I think that suspicion would turn to a certainty.
These settlements, their expansion, they have been viewed as a major impediment to resolving the conflict in the region. How can, though, stability be delivered across the region without Trump employing that leverage as a way to address this major obstacle that really has for decades loomed over Middle East peace?
The settlements in the occupied territories. Well, there are other countries whose views matter, and many countries, including Canada, have imposed sanctions on individuals who have been involved in the worst and most egregious crimes in the Middle East, both people who have been part of the Hamas administration and involved in terrorist acts sanctioned by Hamas, but also extremists involved in the settlement movement who have been creating illegal settlements in Palestinian territories or destroying legitimate Palestinian settlements in their own territories. That pressure has to continue. Ultimately, though, I mean, in the very long term, the only path to peaceful coexistence between the Israelis and the Palestinians is a recognition that they both need each other. That is to say, there will never be peace, stability, and security for Israel unless there's also peace, security, and stability for Palestinians. When we talk about this region, because there is such carnage and such suffering, and it has been going on for so long, it's easy for us, especially as Canadians who live in a large country, to imagine just a vast expanse of killing fields. In reality, the Israeli and Palestinian territories are the size of a postage stamp. Those people all live on top of each other's laps. And there is no future for either of those people that does not involve them living with one another. The real issue, or the real challenge to bring about peace, lies less with transient political actors like Netanyahu and Donald Trump, but more with trying to cultivate what I might call a culture of peace, an understanding that for either people to survive and to flourish, they need the other people to survive and flourish. That sounds like a dream. I know it sounds like a fantasy, but it has happened before.
Akaash Maharaj, really appreciate your analysis today. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and chatting with me.
Thank you. I've enjoyed speaking with you.
That was The Big Story. Please send us feedback on this episode or any other by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. If you'd like to share this episode with a friend, you can find us on the Seeker app, as well as all your favorite podcast players. Would love if you could rate, review, follow, and of course share. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks so much for listening.